In 1946, Congress created the National School Lunch Act for one blunt reason. Too many young men showed up to fight World War II malnourished, and the government decided that could never happen again. For the next 3 decades, that program had one job: put calories in front of kids, as cheaply as the federal budget allowed. By the 1970s, that mission had produced a menu that would be legally impossible to serve today. Salt with no ceiling, fat with no ceiling. A hot lunch tray built entirely around whatever surplus commodity the USDA happened to be sitting on that month. And here's the part almost nobody remembers correctly. Those meals weren't healthy. They weren't balanced. But they were consistent. They were filling. And an entire generation still argues about them online 50 years later. Number 21 on this list started a food fight in Congress that made national news twice, 40 years apart. Number 9 disappeared because of a single Reagan-era policy memo that became a national punchline. These 25 lunches fed roughly 25 million American kids a day at their peak, and every one of them is gone banned, reformulated, or simply too expensive and too fatty for a modern cafeteria to legally plate. Almost none of that food was designed by a chef, a nutritionist, or even a professional cook. It was designed by federal budget math, whatever crop the government had. Too much of that year got shipped to a school kitchen and turned into lunch, whether that was surplus cheese, surplus beef, or an entire warehouse of canned fruit nobody in the private market wanted to buy. That's the thread running underneath every single item on this list. It wasn't cooked to be healthy. It was cooked to use up what the country already had too much of, as cheaply and as fast as one part-time kitchen staff could manage for 500 kids in a 45-minute lunch period. Subscribe before we start, because once this list gets moving, you are not getting off this tray until lunch is over. Number 25, chipped beef on toast. The military called it SOS, cafeterias. Just called it Tuesday. Dried paper thin salted beef got folded into a thick white flour and butter roux and ladled over toasted white bread until the sauce soaked all the way through. It cost pennies per serving because dried beef could sit in a dry storage room for months without spoiling, which made it a favorite of USDA commodity shipments throughout the decade. The sauce alone was often saltier than a serving of bacon. When sodium guidelines tightened toward the end of the 1970s, chipped beef was one of the very first dishes flagged, and it never made a real comeback. Number 24, liver and onions. The USDA's own nutrition guidance in the early 1970s pushed liver hard, since organ meat delivered iron and vitamin A, cheaper than almost anything else on the commodity list. Cooks dredged thin slices in flour, pan-fried them until the edges curled, and buried the result under caramelized onions and a scoop of instant mashed potatoes. It split every lunchroom in the country in half. Kids either forced it down because it tasted exactly like something their grandmother made, or they slid the tray straight into the trash. Participation numbers on Liver Day were tracked by food service directors specifically because the drop-off was so dramatic, and by the mid-1980s, most districts had quietly pulled it from rotation for good. What makes Liver Day interesting in hindsight is that it wasn't a marketing failure or a recipe problem. It was one of the only dishes on this entire list that got removed for taste reasons alone, rather than because a federal nutrition rule finally caught up with it. Kids simply refused to eat it in large enough numbers that keeping it on the menu stopped making financial sense for districts being reimbursed per meal actually served. Number 23, tuna noodle casserole. Canned tuna, canned cream of mushroom soup, and egg noodles baked under a crushed potato chip or breadcrumb topping. This dish existed because canned tuna was one of the cheapest protein sources the commodity program distributed, and cream soup casseroles were the single most efficient way 1970s cafeteria kitchens knew how to stretch a small amount of protein across a huge number of trays. It required almost no skill and reheated well in steam tables for hours, which made it a Friday staple in Catholic school districts that still observed meatless Friday. Rising sodium and fat standards, plus a general 1990s pivot away from canned cream soup cooking, ended its run. Number 22, tater tot, hotdish ground beef, a full can of cream of mushroom soup, and a blanket of frozen tater tots baked until the top went dark and crackling while the meat underneath turned into a thick, savory slurry. It was, and still is, treated as a near-sacred dish across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, where school districts serve versions of it weekly. It cost the district only a few cents per portion, took 20 minutes of prep, and let the oven do the rest for the remaining hour. Modern nutrition standards target exactly the combination that made it work: processed potato product, canned condensed soup, and full-fat ground beef, which is why it essentially cannot exist in a federally reimbursed lunch anymore. Number 21. Ketchup and the vegetable that wasn't. This isn't one dish. It's a fight over one condiment that reshaped every tray on this list. In 1981, the Reagan administration needed to cut roughly $1.5 billion from child nutrition funding and gave the USDA 90 days to figure out how school lunches could get cheaper without technically getting less nutritious on paper. One line in the proposed rule allowed administrators to credit condiments like tomato paste and pickle relish toward the vegetable requirement. Ketchup itself was never named directly, but reporters and outraged parents connected the dots instantly, and ketchup as a vegetable became a national scandal within days. Secretary of Agriculture John Block tried to defend it. Senators staged a photo-op lunch on the Capitol steps with the exact proposed tray, and Reagan withdrew the rule within 3 weeks. The same fight resurfaced in 2011 when Congress specifically blocked a USDA attempt to limit how much tomato paste on pizza could count as a vegetable serving, meaning the argument over what counts as a vegetable in a school cafeteria has now spanned 2 different presidencies 30 years apart. Both times, the opposition came from the same direction: food processing companies and agricultural lobbies that stood to lose a federally subsidized customer if the rules actually tightened. In 1981, it was framed as protecting condiment makers from an overreaching bureaucracy. In 2011, it was frozen pizza manufacturers and potato growers, pushing back on the exact same logic. The specific food changed. The argument and the money behind it didn't. Number 20. Bologna and American cheese sandwiches. 2 slices of white bread, a thick disc of bologna, and a square of individually wrapped American cheese that refused to fully melt even under a heat lamp. No cooking required, no equipment needed, just an assembly line on stainless steel counters, which made it the fastest, cheapest lunch a cafeteria could produce for the days when the kitchen staff was short-handed. Bologna moved through USDA commodity channels by the truckload because it used cuts of beef and pork that had no other commercial market. Once processed meat sodium limits and nitrate concerns tightened in the 1980s and 90s, Bologna slid off approved commodity lists in most states, and the sandwich went with it. Number 19. Chicken fried steak with cream gravy. Across Texas, Oklahoma, and the broader South. This wasn't a menu item, it was regional identity on a tray. A cube steak got pounded flat, dredged, and dropped into a deep fryer until the crust turned shatteringly crisp, then smothered under a peppery white gravy thick enough to hold a spoon upright. The beef itself was tough, frozen commodity beef that needed exactly this treatment to be edible, which is precisely why Southern districts built entire weekly menus around it. The removal of deep fryers from public school kitchens in the early 2000s, driven by fat content standards and, in many districts, simple liability and maintenance costs, ended chicken fried steak for good. A baked cutlet under gravy is a completely different food, and everyone who grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line will tell you so. First pattern. Here's a number that explains almost everything else on this list. In 1970, fried and pre-fried frozen entrees made up roughly 6% of what schools served. By 1990, that number had climbed past 50%. That's not a taste preference. That's an entire national kitchen system quietly restructuring itself around the deep fryer, because fried food held its texture and its flavor through hours sitting in a steam table without turning to mush. Every crispy item left on this list, the fish sticks, the corn dogs, the chicken fried steak, exists because of that one operational fact, and every one of them died the moment districts started ripping fryers out of their kitchens for good. By 1995, the average school lunch was running close to 900 calories, driven almost entirely by that fried, pre-cooked entree category. And that single statistic is what eventually brought federal regulators back to the table decades later. The fryer didn't just define the taste of 1970s and 80s school food, it defined the entire cost structure, the entire prep timeline, and eventually, the entire political fight that reshaped the cafeteria all over again. Number 18. Rectangular sheet pan pizza. Not restaurant pizza, and never meant to be. Companies like Schwann's engineered this specifically for institutional kitchens that needed to feed 500 kids in under an hour. Par-baked frozen dough, a sweet tomato sauce built more like a spread than a marinara, and a blended processed cheese designed to melt evenly across a full sheet pan without scorching. Participation on Pizza Day ran dramatically higher than any other menu item, so much so that districts deliberately scheduled it on Fridays to end the week on a high note. The recipe has been reformulated repeatedly to hit sodium and whole grain targets since, to the point where the pizza kids eat today shares a name with the 70s version and almost nothing else. What's easy to miss is how deliberately districts leaned on Pizza Day as a tool, rather than just a menu item. Food service directors quietly used it to offset unpopular main courses earlier in the week, knowing that even kids who skipped Liver Day or Fish Stick Day would show up in force on Friday. That single dish, more than any other on this list, kept overall program participation numbers high enough to justify the federal reimbursement math behind the entire cafeteria. Number 17. Peanut Butter Bars Dense. Chewy bars made from peanut butter, oats, brown sugar, and butter, finished with a thin chocolate glaze while still warm from the oven. They functioned as informal currency in cafeterias, traded for milk, traded for the good dessert, confiscated from pockets by lunch monitors who knew exactly what kids were smuggling out. Starting in the mid-2000s, districts began removing peanut products from kitchens entirely as allergy awareness and diagnosed peanut allergy rates climbed. By 2011, close to 60% of American schools had banned peanut products outright. The bars didn't get reformulated. They vanished completely, with no substitute dessert ever filling the exact gap they left. Number 16. Fish sticks with tartar sauce. Friday meant fish, especially in the many public school districts built around Catholic communities that still observed meatless Fridays. Breaded, deep-fried rectangles of reformed whitefish, usually cod, pollock, or whiting ground into paste, arrived beside a foil packet of tartar sauce and a scoop of coleslaw that nobody touched. The breading, not the fish, was the entire point. A case of frozen sticks cost a school district only a few dollars and fed well over 100 kids. Today's cafeteria fish sticks are baked, use whole grain breading, and are often served with a lemon wedge instead of tartar sauce. Nutritionally sound swap that also removed the crunch that made the original worth eating. Number 15. Sloppy Joes on a soft bun. Seasoned ground beef in a sweet, tangy tomato sauce, too loose to stay in the bun and too thick to be soup, which meant the bottom half of the bun dissolved into an orange sponge before you'd finished half the sandwich. Many districts used canned commercial sauce bases straight from a can, while others guarded homemade versions like State Secrets. The Sloppy Joe actually survived longer than most dishes here, but modern versions use leaner meat, less added sugar, and whole wheat buns engineered specifically not to fall apart, which ironically means the reformulated version fails at the one thing that made the original memorable. Number 14. Salisbury steak with brown gravy. An oval patty of seasoned ground beef, denser than a burger and softer than meatloaf, baked in gravy thick enough to double as mortar, and served next to mashed potatoes built specifically to dam that gravy in place. The gravy beef base, flour and butter, in quantities a modern nutritionist would flag immediately did. The actual work of turning a plain patty into a meal kids looked forward to. Reformulated versions today use low-sodium gravy and leaner turkey blend patties, and while it's a smarter plate on paper, it isn't the same dish at all. Number 13. Buttered canned corn. A perfectly round, glistening scoop that showed up on trays 3 or 4 times a week, no matter what the entree was. USDA commodity corn shipped to districts by the pallet in number 10 cans, opened with hand crank openers, then simmered with butter and salt until it turned soft, sweet, and shiny. It was one of the only sides on the entire tray the kids ate without a single complaint. Modern versions are steamed from frozen, without added butter and often without added salt, which is nutritionally sound and also explains why almost nobody remembers today's cafeteria corn fondly. Second pattern. In 1979, the USDA quietly rewrote its own guidance so that a school lunch only had to provide minimum nutritional value to qualify for federal reimbursement. That single phrase is the hinge this entire era swings on. It opened the door for vending machines, a la carte snack bars, and competitive food sales to move directly into school buildings, which meant kids could now buy candy, chips, and soda within 50 feet of the cafeteria line. Participation in the actual federal lunch program dropped, and the revenue that came with it dropped alongside it. Districts responded the only way they could. They made the tray taste more like what the vending machine was already selling. More sugar, more sodium, more processing, until the lunch line was competing directly with the snack aisle down the hall. Every dish left on this list exists in the shadow of that one 1979 memo. 12. Grilled cheese with tomato soup. 2 slices of white bread, 2 slices of American cheese griddled until golden, served beside a styrofoam cup of institutional tomato soup, hot enough to scald your tongue. Dipping the corner of the sandwich into the soup was a ritual performed identically in every state, without anyone ever teaching it. Whole grain bread requirements and reduced sodium soup standards changed both halves of the dish, and the version schools serve now checks every nutritional box while satisfying almost nobody the way the original did. Number 11. Corn dogs. A hot dog on a stick, dipped in slightly sweet cornmeal batter and deep fried until the coating puffed and cracked. It was carnival food that had wandered onto a school lunch tray, and kids treated it exactly that way, working down the stick like a popsicle. A case of 50 corn dogs cost a district only a few dollars, and Corn Dog Day routinely rivaled Pizza Day for turnout. Once fryers left the building, corn dogs went with them. Baked versions exist, but the batter never puffs the same way without hot oil. So what's left is really just a hot dog wearing a costume. Number 10. Hard-shell tacos. Not authentic tacos by any stretch, school tacos. A pre-formed hard corn shell packed with seasoned ground beef, shredded iceberg lettuce, diced tomato, and a fistful of shredded cheddar, engineered to crack apart the moment you bit into it and send filling straight down your shirt. Taco seasoning packets mixed into commodity ground beef turned entire cafeterias into a haze of cumin and chili powder on Taco Day. Today's version almost always uses a soft whole wheat tortilla with leaner beef and reduced fat cheese, which nutritionally is a clear improvement and structurally is really just a folded burrito wearing a taco's name. Number 9. Scratch-made chocolate pudding. Not the sealed plastic cups. Made from actual cocoa powder, sugar, cornstarch, whole milk, and butter, cooked in steel pots until it thickened into a glossy, dark pudding that kitchen staff spooned into paper cups by hand, sometimes finished with a swirl of whipped topping. By the early 1980s, instant powdered mixes replaced scratch cooking almost everywhere, driven by labor costs and prep time rather than any nutrition mandate. The from-scratch version simply required a level of kitchen staffing that shrinking food service budgets could no longer support. Number 8. Meatloaf with ketchup-glazed ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and onion, baked in loaf pans and sliced into portions that landed on the tray with an audible thud. The top lacquered in a sweet ketchup glaze that caramelized dark around the edges during baking. It was the most home-style dish the cafeteria produced, and it disappeared largely for logistical reasons as school food service moved toward individually portioned, pre-tracked entrees that could be measured precisely for nutrition labeling. A loaf sliced by hand in uneven portions simply didn't fit the new system anymore. Number 7. Scratch-made macaroni and cheese. Not boxed, not frozen. Cooks built an actual roux from butter and flour, whisked in whole milk, and melted in pounds of sharp cheddar, along with commodity American cheese, until the sauce coated the back of a serving paddle, then folded an elbow macaroni and baked it in deep hotel pans until the top blistered golden. It required time, kitchen skill, and ingredient volumes that modern per-meal food cost limits simply can't accommodate, which is why almost every school mac and cheese served today starts from a pre-made base rather than a roux. Third pattern. The people cooking all of this were rarely trained chefs. Most cafeteria staff were local mothers hired part-time at minimum wage, learning to feed hundreds of children a day through recipe cards printed by the USDA's own Food and Nutrition Service, alongside pure trial and error. They came in before sunrise. They peeled potatoes by hand, and they stirred pots the size of trash cans with wooden paddles as long as a baseball bat. When districts shifted toward heat and serve, pre-portioned meals, through the 1980s and 90s to cut labor costs, they weren't just changing recipes. They were phasing out the entire role of the scratch-cooking cafeteria worker who knew by instinct exactly how much longer the rolls needed or how much more pepper the gravy wanted. The recipes weren't the only thing lost. The people who carried them in their heads left too. Number 6. Cinnamon rolls served alongside chili. This pairing sounds invented, but it's a real regional tradition, especially across Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, where a bowl of thick, meaty chili was served next to a fresh-baked, heavily frosted cinnamon roll the size of a fist. Kids tore pieces off the roll and dunked them straight into the chili, letting sweet frosting meet spicy heat in a combination that somehow worked. The chili survived in a reduced sodium form, but a fully frosted pastry simply cannot be counted as a lunch component under modern standards, so the pairing lost its other half and became just soup. Number 5. Open-faced turkey and gravy. Effectively Thanksgiving on a rotating schedule, served roughly every other week from fall through spring. A slice of white bread laid flat, covered in sliced turkey loaf pressed and reformed, never carved from an actual bird, then drowned in a ladle of gravy made from real turkey drippings, flour, and enough butter to make a cardiologist wince. Mashed potatoes and a perfect cylinder of canned cranberry sauce, complete with the ridges from the can, rounded out the tray. Because the gravy did all the work, this was one of the rare dishes almost every kid actually finished, and modern reduced sodium, reduced fat gravy versions have never managed the same effect on a slice of bread. Number 4. Whole milk in a wax carton. That half-pint waxed carton, with the fold-out spout that either popped clean on the first try or crushed into a leaking mess down your chin, was as core to the tray as the food itself. Federal rules required milk with every meal, and whole milk was the standard variety served through the 1970s and well beyond. That changed permanently under the 2010 Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, which by the 2012 to 13 school year restricted school milk to fat-free and 1% varieties only, effectively banning whole and 2% milk from cafeterias nationwide. Fluid milk consumption in schools declined afterward, and the policy has remained a genuine point of ongoing political debate. As recently as 2025, Congress was still actively negotiating legislation to bring whole milk back into cafeterias, more than a decade after it was removed. That bill, backed by lawmakers from both parties and the dairy industry alike, argues that kids simply won't drink the thinner, less flavorful milk that replaced it, and that overall milk consumption dropping is a worse outcome than the original fat content ever was. Whichever side of that argument you land on, the wax carton itself, full fat, unapologetic, occasionally impossible to open without soaking your shirt, is not coming back to a cafeteria tray anytime soon. Number 3. The original Sloppy Joe adjacent. Manwich commodity. Beef districts that didn't guard a secret sauce recipe simply opened cans of Manwich sauce and stirred it into commodity ground beef, a shortcut that lets smaller, understaffed rural districts serve the same Sloppy Joe experience as bigger schools with dedicated cooks. It's a small detail, but it explains something important about this whole era. Commodity foods and shelf-stable canned sauces weren't a shortcut cafeterias were ashamed of. They were the entire infrastructure the National School Lunch Program was built on, going all the way back to its 1946 origins in surplus farm commodity distribution. Number 2, fruit cocktail and heavy syrup. Diced peaches, pears, grapes, and unnervingly bright cherry halves, all swimming in a syrup so thick it visibly coated the spoon. USDA's commodity program shipped it to schools by the millions of cans, making it the default dessert of the entire decade. Kids hunted the cherries first, the grapes second, and left the pears behind in the syrup almost every time. Current USDA standards now require fruit be packed in juice or water rather than syrup, nutritionally sound. But it removed the exact quality, the candy-like sweetness that made the dish a dessert in the first place, rather than just a fruit cup. Number 1, the lunch lady herself. Not a dish, but the one irreplaceable ingredient behind every item on this list. She wasn't a trained chef, she wasn't well paid, and she often had no professional food service background before her first day on the job. She learned commodity cooking from government recipe cards, trial, error, and word of mouth, passed between kitchens in the same district. When school food service shifted toward heat and serve, prepackaged, centrally distributed meals through the 1980s and 90s, districts weren't only trying to hit new nutrition targets, they were also cutting labor, and that meant cutting her. The gravy that needed more pepper, the rolls that needed 5 more minutes, the instinct for a tray. 1,000 kids would actually eat none of that. Survived the transition into a warming oven and a box cutter. Tell me which one hit hardest the ketchup as a vegetable fight, the cinnamon roll dunked in chili, or that wax carton of whole milk you haven't tasted in over a decade. Drop it in the comments below. These weren't just meals. For one specific stretch of American history, they were the closest thing an entire generation had to eating the exact same lunch, on the exact same day, in cafeterias 3,000 miles apart. And once the fryers came out and the budgets tightened, that particular version of school lunch was never coming back.